皆様ごきげんよう. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This video focuses on the writing stroke order of hiragana. By the way, if you're interested, I made a hiragana chart and some hiragana practice worksheets, which I will be using in this video as well. The hiragana chart and worksheets are available to download for free, so if you're interested, the link will be posted on the description box down below. When it comes to stroke orders, there are many opinions if the correct stroke orders are necessary to learn, and so I will just simply state my personal opinion here. My personal opinion is that the stroke order is important. In the Japanese culture, similar to many other Eastern Asian cultures, handwriting was and is considered very important. The reason for this is because of the belief that one's handwriting is a reflection of one's personality. If you have a neat handwriting, you are a neat person. If you have a messy handwriting, people might consider you as a person who is not neat, maybe a little bit messy. Although this culture is not as strong as it used to be, I do think it is an important part of our culture and who we are as Japanese. So it is not mandatory, but this system was developed over the years so that people can write neatly in the easiest way possible. This video is not focusing on pronunciation of the hiragana, and so if you're interested in knowing how to pronounce these letters more naturally, please check my description box down below, where I have posted a link to a guide to hiragana pronunciation. So, stroke order. I tried my very best to make animations to show stroke orders, but I know this is not the best, so bear with me. When you practice writing, I strongly recommend you to write with a pencil, not a pen, but a pencil on an actual sheet of paper. If you have a tablet, yes, I know how much we love our tablets, but still, I do encourage the usage of paper and pencil, and here is why. Japanese was originally written with brushes. When you look at the letters, you see characteristics that makes our writings a little bit more unique. There are 3 ways of ending a stroke in Japanese writings, and pencils are a lot easier to imitate how brushes do this and get used to the ways of writing. The 3 ways of ending a stroke is called tome, hane, and harai. Tome means to stop. Hane means to bounce up, to make an upward brush stroke, or in my own words, to kind of ting up. Harai is to brush, to sweep, or to make the swoosh movement in the end. To end the stroke by thinning out the lines by raising the brush, or in our days, pencils or pens. When you write the letters, I do encourage you to listen to me as I pronounce the words, repeat after me, and say it by yourself and write it at the same time. As hard as it may sound, the best way for your brain to register new information is when you use as many of the 5 senses that you have. Also, I am not a professional in Japanese calligraphy, and I also know that this tome, hane, and harai has changed over the years, and what I have learned in elementary school might not be how other generations, older or younger, have learned. So, having this in mind, I hope you find this just as one of the many sources of practicing writing. Let's start with the first letter, A. A has 3 strokes. The first 2 stroke ends with a tome, or a stop, and the last stroke ends with a harai, the swoosh stroke, or the one that you thin out the lines. E only has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a hane, the stroke that jumps up or tings up, and the second stroke ends with a tome, the stop. One thing to keep in mind is that the second stroke is shorter than the first. This is important, for there is another letter that is 2 vertical strokes, and the way to distinguish the difference between these 2 are to see whether the second stroke is shorter than the first stroke or not. U has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second stroke ends with a harai. The next is e. E also has 2 strokes. They both end with a stop, the tome, and the second stroke, although it might look very long, make sure that you don't lift your pen or pencils from the paper as you write. The line is continuous. O has 3 strokes. The first stroke ends with a tome, the second harai, and the last stroke with a hane. Ka has 3 strokes. The first and the last ends with a hane, and the second ends with a tome. The downward line from the first stroke and the second stroke should be almost parallel as you write. Ki has 4 strokes. Every stroke except for the third ends with a tome, and the third ends with a hane. Ku is fairly simple. It is a letter that just looks like a bent stick. The next is ke. This has 3 strokes. The first stroke ends with a hane, the second with a tome, and the third with a harai. Ko only has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a hane, and the second stroke ends with a tome. I know that this looks like I that we have went through, but remember, I has 2 vertical lines, while ko has 2 horizontal lines. Sa has 3 strokes. First stroke and the last stroke ends with a tome, and the second stroke ends with a hane. This also resembles another letter ki, and the way to distinguish the two is the number of horizontal lines. While ki has 2, sa has only 1. Shi is very simple. It only has 1 stroke that ends with a harai, and it looks like a fish hook. Su has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second with a harai. Se has 3 strokes. The first horizontal stroke ends with a tome, the second stroke with a hane, and the last with a tome. The next is so. This only has 1 stroke. Just like many other letters that looks complicated yet having only 1 stroke, make sure that you finish writing this without letting go of your pencil until you finish the stroke. The ending is a tome. Ta has 4 strokes. The first 2 ends with a tome, the third with a hane, and the last one with a tome. Chi has 2 strokes. I know this looks like the number 5 a little bit. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second with a harai. Tsu is one of those that has only 1 stroke. It ends with a harai. For those who get confused by this and shi, tsu starts with a horizontal line and shi with a vertical line. Te also only has 1 stroke and it ends with a tome. The next is to. To has 2 strokes that both end with a tome. The first stroke is not as important when it comes to how you end it, but it will look better if you stop the line as it will be easier to cover that over with the second stroke. Na has 4 strokes. The first 2 strokes ends with a tome, the third with a hane, and the last one with a tome. I know that the left half of ta and na looks similar, but while the first 2 strokes of ta goes all the way to the bottom of the letter, na only goes to about 3/4 of the letter. Ni has 3 strokes. The first two ends with a hane, and the last stroke with a tome. Nu might look a little bit familiar to you. It looks like the bottom half of the letter a. Nu has two strokes that both end with tome, and the second stroke has a little circular motion going on before the end. Ne has two strokes. Both strokes ends with a tome, and again for the second stroke, make sure you don't cut it off as you are writing it. Keep your pencil down on the paper until you finish the stroke. No is probably one of the most simple ones, one stroke that ends with a harai, and that is just it. Ha has only 3 strokes. The first stroke ends with a hane, and the last two ends with a tome. He has only 1 stroke and it ends with a tome. Hu is really hard to keep the balance of. You start with the top stroke that ends with a hane. You move down from there, which the second stroke ends with a harai. The third stroke is the stroke on the left side, and you end with a hane. The last stroke is on the right side, and you end with a tome. He has only 1 stroke, and it ends with a tome. Ho has 4 strokes. The first ends with a hane, and the rest ends with a tome. The difference between ha and ho is the number of horizontal lines on the right side. Ha has only 1, and ho has 2. The next one is ma. Ma looks like the right-hand side of ho, which we just went through. The difference is that the middle stroke sticks through the top horizontal line. Ma has 3 strokes, and they all end with a tome. Mi has 2 strokes. The first stroke is a little complicated. Just make sure that the horizontal line is long enough that you can put the second stroke on it. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second stroke with a harai. Mu has 3 strokes. The first stroke ends with a tome, the second with a harai, and the last with a hane. Me looks very similar to nu. The difference is the way of ending the second stroke. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second stroke ends with a harai. This also doesn't have the little circular motion at the end. Mo has 3 strokes. The first stroke ends with a harai, and the last 2 horizontal lines ends with a tome. Ya has 3 strokes. The first stroke ends with a harai, the second with a hane, and the last with a tome. Yu has 2 strokes. They both end with a harai. The next is yo. The first stroke is shorter and it might look more balanced if you align the end of the 2 strokes at the end. They both will end with a tome. La has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a hane, and the second with a harai. Li has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a hane, and the second with a harai. This has 2 vertical lines just like E, and the difference is that E has a shorter second stroke than the first, and Li has a longer second stroke, almost double the length of the first stroke. Lu has only 1 stroke. There isn't technically a way to end this stroke, but tome might be just the safest way. The ending should be covered by the stroke itself so that you can't technically see the ending point of this letter. Le has 2 strokes. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second with a harai. Lo looks very similar to lu. The difference is the ending. While you can't see the ending point of the letter lu, you can for lo. Lo ends with a harai. Wa has two strokes. The first stroke ends with a tome, and the second with a harai. O has three strokes. They all end with a tome, and they are all connected by crossing the previous strokes. Last but not least, we have has only one stroke and it ends with a harai. So there you have it. All 46 letters of the most basic Japanese alphabet. I also made a more simple separate video for the stroke order so that you can focus on the ones that you want to practice more, which link will be posted on the description box down below. I know this was a longer video and I want to compliment you on sticking to the end and trying your best. よく頑張りましたね。お疲れ様です。I will see you in my other videos. For now, ladies and gentlemen, ごきげんよう。